for entertainment purposes only. We're going to look at insider trading for stock Leggett Platt. Now, this is important because the executives who really know the business, we'll see what they're doing with their stock. And something to really keep in mind is the fact that they get paid through dividends. So they get, almost like a salary by owning the stock. So the fact that they're willing to sell does say a little bit more than just the average stock. Okay, so we can see a few sales here at the end of 2019, and looking further, we see quite a few more sales towards the end of 2019. And so that second last month, let's say November, right? The end of October, November, we saw quite a few executives selling their stock. And so let's take a look at what's going on. And something else worth mentioning is that I actually found very few instances of executives buying stock. It's mostly just they get awarded their stock and eventually they'll sell it, or I suppose take the dividends from the stock. But let's take a closer look with that in mind. Okay, so Ms. Wood, she sold 23,000 shares, give or take, of her, and she was left over with 53,000 shares. So, let's say she had 76,000 shares, now she has 53,000 shares. It's almost like she sold pretty much like a third of her stock. Certainly, let's say a quarter, more than a quarter. That's for sure. Okay, so when did she sell? Well, we can see at the beginning of November she sold some stock, and then also 2019 she sold as a gift, I suppose, but it's only 540 stock. That to me is not a big deal, not something that really registers. But once again, this major selling of a third of her stock happened in November, and if you look at the stock chart here, now this is summarized by the weekly, but nevertheless, quite a peak. So it's almost like she sold exactly when she knew when to sell. That's what it looks like anyway. And we're going to see more executives and what they were doing and how well they're doing it. Nevertheless, I had to go back quite a ways, and I was able to find another sale that she made. Now here you can see it's only a sale of, 1,000 of her stock. And it happened, in 2015. And you can see it's pretty high. It's not the peak, so the fact that this person got the peak, I assume is, I wouldn't call it lucky. I would say, let's say, insider knowledge, they have an advantage. But, I think it's rare for someone to get the peak. Well, even for people who play the stock market, even for insiders, that's very difficult, I think. And so nevertheless, even here in 2015, she chose a pretty good time as well. So this person clearly has a pretty good idea of the market. And I think the last time she sold was even before 2012, and that's going quite a ways back. And we're not going to bother with that, I don't think. But clearly here's someone who knew or seemed to know generally that the stock was presumably overvalued. Did they know about everything that was going to happen in the world? I'm not sure. I'm not going to go that far. I think they just, if you look at the stock chart here, $55 is quite high. It seems to get over 50 and then continually come back down. And so it's very possible that she just felt that, $55 is quite a lot of money. I'm going to take my stock out instead of getting the dividends. And she sold a third of her stock. Maybe she wanted to retire. Maybe she needed extra money. But she clearly took, I think, quite a large sum because she just thought it was an opportune time. Okay, now let's look at Mr. Enlow. So he sold only 6,000 shares of his stock, but he only had 40,000. So once again, you're talking about, over 10%, obviously less than 20%, but a significant amount of stock. And similarly, at the end of November, the 27th this time. And so if we look at his sale record, you can see at the beginning, of course, we just mentioned, at the end of November, he sold, 7,000 of his stock. And then in the middle of 2018, he also sold a similar amount, 5,000 of his stock. Then at the beginning of 2018, he sold a similar amount, another 6,000 of his stock of Leggett Platt. And then it goes all the way back to the middle of 2016, where he sold a smaller amount of his stock. And so it's a little bit hard to tell, is this a normal sales pattern or not, right? That's the key thing. Is this person just paying for some expenses that he has or not, right? That is, I suppose, the very difficult question. And so let's look at when he sold to get a general gist. But you can kind of see he's selling a little bit more each time. In 2018, he sold quite a bit. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so obviously we know that the end of 2019, that was a prime time to sell. And of course, he got above, not the peak like the previous executive, but nevertheless, a really good time. And to be clear, a lot of these sales don't happen all of a sudden, specifically one day, specifically one time. They tend to be sold over a certain amount of time. But nevertheless, this is kind of the stock chart he would have been roughly looking at when you zoom out anyway. Okay, so when we look at 2018, the middle over there, so over here, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because if you look a few months or a year before, obviously the stock was doing better. But it could be he needed his money around 2018, or it could be that simply he saw the fact that the stock, he felt, maybe wasn't going to do well, right? If you look towards the end of 2018, 2019, it's quite lower, and this is quite a peak for the next 2 years. So he might have seen the company stagnating or having difficulty. They were exiting fashion beds. Maybe he saw that as a problem. And of course, he sold a little bit earlier at the beginning of 2018. So once again, maybe he saw kind of this going down, and then he saw the stock jump up. He saw another opportunity before maybe it was going to get worse. I don't know. These are, once again, hard things to know exactly what was going on. But certainly in 2016, he sold at quite a high. That's the way I would look at it. The stock had never been so high, obviously. So once again, maybe he's selling when he felt that it reached kind of some sort of threshold like the previous executive. Maybe that's the thinking. And of course, it kept going up. And there was a somewhat higher peak. But nevertheless, when you kind of think about it, in terms of the whole history of the stock, there's very few times it got this high. And so, it seems like he's kind of doing quite well. And even the previous stock prices that he stole at, which were quite lower, well, once again, maybe he just felt he needed the money. He waited 2 years and he didn't see it go up and it was going down. And so, perhaps he sold. Yeah, if he would wait another 3 years, but maybe he didn't want to wait 3 years. So obviously someone who kind of sees the value. And once again, this $50 to $55 seems, as far as these two executives, overpriced, I suppose, or a prime time to sell the stock. Okay, now if we look a little bit further back in his history, you have to go back all the way to 2013, the middle of 2013. And if we see over here, once again, he sold the stock. Looks like a peak as far as I can tell, and it took quite a few years to get back there. So similar ideas we're talking about here. And back then it was only $33, but it's quite high, and it hadn't been that high for quite some time. Okay, so let's go to the next person, the executive. So this is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Development, Mr. Iorio. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that name, my mistake. He sold 26,000 shares, right? And he had pretty much 100,000 shares at that point, give or take. So he's selling a quarter of his shares, right? That is quite a large amount. And of course, it's important to mention that, you can see at the bottom of this Form 4 that these are stock options that, are dating back since, 2012, for example, or 2013. So this person has been holding on to them for quite some time, and now he's selling them at the end of 2019, right at the beginning of November, or I should say at the end of October, right, the 30th. Okay, and if we look at his sale record, right, you can see that he is selling, first of all, at the end of November, right, at the 25th of November, and then at the end of October, we mentioned, the 30th specifically, so he saw a number of times where this was an opportune time to sell. And then, if you look a little bit further at his record, right, you have to go back to the beginning of 2019, so once again, you see another peak that he hit. And, it is important to mention, right, when you look at this stock chart, you're not looking from zero, right? If you look at that bottom number, it's 15 and it's going to 55. So it's a little bit zoomed in. And if you looked from, 0 to 60, for example, maybe this peak doesn't seem as impressive. But from my perspective, it is still a peak. And I just want to point out, maybe it's not as Jurassic as we're kind of looking at it so far, but it is quite serious. Okay, so now let's look at Carl Glassman. So he's the president and CEO. This is from my perspective, a very important person. He's been part of the company, I think we said, from 1982. So, we're talking about 40 years part of the company, someone who has an enormous, right, 600,000, roughly, shares of this stock. And, of course, he sold, right, an enormous amount. He sold about 80,000, whatever it was. But an enormous amount of this stock was sold at that time. And so we have to really take an idea what's going on. Why did he sell at this time, and how often does it happen, and what's the signal here, right? because he also is selling at the end of October, right? You can see they're all selling at this exact time. They all kind of see the exact same, I suppose, pattern. And you can see at the end of 2019, it's not just at the end of October, but even in the middle of September, right? So let's take a look and see what's going on, right? So at the end of October, once again, we already know this was pretty much a peak time. At the middle of September, though, not quite a peak time, right? It shot up quite a bit since then. So is his outlook perfect? No, it doesn't seem like it. And that really is important when you look at these executives. And this is the executive who knows, quote unquote, the most. Now, it is possible that, in fact, at the end of the day, maybe he just needed some money, right? And when you're looking at the amount of stock he sold, right, we're talking about a similar amount. So it's unclear to me that you can kind of just say, oh, he's, prophetic, or he knows everything, or he doesn't know everything. He's clearly selling at 2 times here, one where it's a great peak, one where it wasn't so much. Now, obviously, the $40 is not bad, in the past, year or two. That's not horrible price, but it's not great. It's not the peak at the beginning of 2019, and certainly at the end of 2019. And so, word of the warning, take everything in terms of these executive sales with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, he sold 10,000 shares at the end of in the middle, close to the end of 2019, right? September, the stock shot up more, and he sold even more. So that to me is a flag, meaning he sold already. It's not necessarily that all of a sudden he needs another huge amount of cash, within a month. And so that I would take as a red flag when the president CEO like this sells, and then it jumps up and he decides to sell again. That I think is more of a red flag from my perspective, right? And that's the way you have to kind of look at this. Now, the next time he sold was at the beginning of 2018, so not exactly a set pattern, right? Well, 2019 was the end. Here we're seeing the beginning of 2018, but once again, quite a good price. Like we said with one of the previous executives, maybe the price was going down. He saw this as an opportunity to finally purchase. Maybe he realized it wouldn't be at this type of price for quite some time. And so in terms of, the next few years, this is quite a peak. So pretty good timing. Once again, obviously, if he had sold earlier, a year earlier, this would have been much better. But if we look, well, in fact, he did sell 13,000 shares in the middle of 2017, where would that be? That would be the peak. So it's not that he missed the peak, it's that he sold some shares in the peak. The next year, maybe he wanted to sell some more shares, and he chose not the peak, but quite a good time, nevertheless, right? So to me, this is very important, right? It seems like he has a generally good idea of what's happening with the company. Okay, so now if we look a little bit further in terms of his sales, right? So we can see, once again, at the beginning of 2017, he's selling quite a large amount of stock. Where is that? Once again, quite a high level, maybe not the peak, but once again, a few months later, it goes even higher maybe than he expected, and so he sells. And then, of course, since then, it's pretty much gone down for quite a bit, except for, at the end of 2019 when peaked up quite a bit. So he has a general idea, right? That's the key, that these people are not fortune tellers, right? They're not telling you, oh, I know exactly what's going to happen. It's the idea that they have a general feeling. I think that's the important point. And once again, if you look at this zoomed out map, for that beginning of 2017, you can kind of see it does look pretty much that he's sold at a level, $48. He's sold at a level that is quite high for the stock, right? So once again, although, a few months later, you can see that little peak going up. And so when we look on this stock chart, that later peak looks quite substantially higher up. But remember, when you're looking from the $0 to $60 range, zoomed out that far, that peak is not quite as much. And you can see that this level at the beginning of 2017 is quite high for the whole history, the whole history of the stock. So someone who can clearly, maybe not quote unquote perfectly time the market, but very good analysis here. And so once again, if we look a little bit further, we can see actually quite a large sale this time, in 2016, right? The end of 2016, he sold, 20,000 shares, and then again, 2 months before that, another 20,000 shares. So if we look at those times, once again, it looks like quite a high peak over here, quite a high peak over here. These are, he's selling at great times in terms of the stock. And that really tells you something. And so now when we look further back in terms of his selling, and we're pretty much going to be trailing off here, but in the beginning of 2015, he also sold 20,000, right, worth of stock. And now, when you look at it here, it does not look like a great time, right? It does not look like a perfect time to sell. But when you consider the fact, and we'll go forward a little bit here in terms of 2013, but if you consider the past history of the stock, this is a really high time, right? And so maybe he was thinking, oh yeah, I want to sell, and he's putting off his sale, as far as he can, and this is high, and compared to the history, it's high, and what's going to happen. So it's not a peak, but it's also not the lowest it's been. It's not great timing, but from my perspective, if you're putting yourself in his shoes, it's very possible that he waited not as long as he could, but a legitimate amount of time. Maybe he knew the stock was going up, but more importantly, this is pretty much the highest the stock has been in an enormous amount of time. And, you can see 2013, once again, he also sold. We saw someone else sell in 2013 around this time, also similarly around the peak. And, once again, when you zoom out to the whole history of the stock, going back 40 years, this time in 2013 was quite a high peak. And so 2015, that was also quite a high peak, So once again, obviously went much higher. But in terms of the history of the whole stock, he's never possibly seen the stock that high, and he's thought it was a good time to sell. The other times he sold were pretty good, except we mentioned at the end of 2019, right? He sold at the peak, yes, but he also sold at September, which was not quite such a high peak. And so what the fear that I have from that is, you can see that if you look at this massive trend of this stock, it peaks, around 2017, which we mentioned, which was quite high. 2015, 2017, it's going up. And then from 2017, the stock is kind of going down. Now, yes, there are these peaks, obviously. And 2019, it peaked at the end quite a bit. But nevertheless, the fact that he was selling at the end of 2019, well, that's a little bit scary, because that could signal two things. One thing is that he clearly saw that, maybe he needed the money, so maybe he sold, and he was just waiting. He saw a higher level at the end of 2019. He went for it. And then 3 months later, he saw a peak, and that was, such a great time to sell. So he for sure took advantage as much as he could. But my fear is that here's someone at the end of 2019, September, when it was not such a great deal, right around $40, and he's selling his stock. Maybe he thinks either A, he needs the money, or B, right? B, maybe he sees the stock going down. Forget about the whole situation in the world, just the legitimacy of the stock. And this plays into part 1 and part 2 that we mentioned before. The fact that they have so much competition, and the fact that the company is somewhat stagnating. Maybe he saw that as something to, sell some stock. Now, of course, keep in mind that he has, 500,000 shares, and we're talking about selling, 10,000, 20,000 shares. So he's not like clearing himself out of this stock, but he is clearly, when he sells those shares, picking what I think are really good times. And of course, he's being awarded much more stock than clearly he's selling, because obviously his shares are continually going up. Okay, but let's go on to the next executive now, right? Mrs. Odom, assuming I'm pronouncing that right. This is a director, so she's selling 10,000 of her and she ends up with, 56,000 shares. So, when I look at this type of sale, what am I kind of looking at? Well, this is hard to tell, but it's obviously 10%. It's a massive amount. I should say more than 10%, right? We're getting close to 20%, in fact. It's a massive amount. Once again, it's in line with all the other executives. It's almost like they all saw together that this stock price was way too good to be true in terms of 2019. So, what I'm getting at here, and I think it's really important, is let's pretend this stock is going to bounce back. Is it going to bounce back to those levels that we saw before? I don't think so. I think that might be asking for too much, right? All these people are selling their stock when it gets to those, that $50 range. And to me, that's a little nerve-wracking, because as much as the stock has fallen, obviously everything going on, but maybe it's falling from an artificial high, a high that would have fallen possibly anyway based off of this selling pattern. Did these people know at the end of 2019, beginning of November, everything that was going to happen in the world? I don't think so. That knowledge was probably not well known, certainly in America. And yes, they do have Chinese subsidiaries, but, even in China, I'm not sure how well people understood and knew what was going on. Okay, nevertheless, so this person also sold in the middle of 2017, right, at the end of 2017, 2016 roughly. And so if we look at these times, once again, this person hitting peaks at both times, doing quite well. The middle of 2015, maybe not the peak, but doing quite a high sale. And once again, this is going from a time where this is the highest price that it has ever been, where obviously it dipped before this and came back up. And this is a pretty good sale for, the next year. Yes, there was a slightly higher peak, but nevertheless, obviously it went down quite substantially before coming back a year later. So, not the best time, but a very, very good time. Okay, now let's look just a little bit further at Mr. McLanathan. I hope I'm pronouncing that. I'm sorry, I'm really not great at these names, right? So we're talking about someone who has 4,000 shares being sold, right? And before that, they had around 30,000 shares. So a little bit, around 10%, let's say. So once again, substantial amount. And once again, at the beginning of November. So we can see, right, 2019, at the end, right, there he sold. And then also at the beginning he sold, right, in February. And then once again, we can see into middle of 2017, right? You're seeing these numbers pop up again and again and again when people sell. Now, this time in 2015, he sold at the end in December. We didn't see someone sell in December, but we did see people selling in 2015. And so what I'm trying to get across here now is that people seem to be selling in relatively the same times. It's almost like they all know. I'm not saying that they all agreed to sell or something like that, but maybe they discussed the company. Maybe they all have the same general feeling, right? So I think this is a really, really important sign that you're seeing people sell at the same general times. Now, in terms of the amount being sold, right, you can see at the end of 2019, it was only 4,000, whereas at the beginning of 2019, right, we're talking about 10,000. And then 2017, you're talking about 6,000, and then 2015 at the end, we're talking about 10,000. So the amount kind of varies a little bit, although he did give a gift at that same time. He sold in 2017, which gets you a little bit closer to 10,000. But so let's take a look. So obviously, once again, he hit the peak at the end of 2019. Now, at the beginning of 2019, he hit quite a substantial peak as well, right? That was a really good time to sell at that time. And obviously, when it peaked again at the end of 2019, he saw another opportunity to sell before it was going to, I assume, right, before it went down. Once again, in 2017, he hit quite an opportune time. Now, in 2015, this was, as far as I can tell, a really bad time to sell. A really bad time to sell. So he did not hit the perfect timing in terms of 2015 here, right? And to me, that is important to mention, that these people are not perfect, right? They're not profits. Maybe he just needed the money, or maybe they're not amazing at getting the time right? Maybe he saw the stock went up, he thought the company was going to do better, the stock was going to do better, and he kept seeing it going down. Yes, it peaked and then it came back down, and so he just saw he had to sell. Maybe he was too scared to sell. He thought it was going to go even further down. Of course it didn't, or maybe he just needed money and he waited long enough. It's always hard to tell with these things, but clearly this was not the best time to sell, nevertheless. Okay, and another time he sold was the beginning of 2015, and so here, quite a bit better of a time. Obviously not the best time. Once again, though, this is, as far as I can tell, the best price for the stock in terms of the history of the stock. So, sometimes, one in the hand is better than two in the bush, as they say. So maybe he knew the stock might have gone up further. Maybe he didn't know. He wasn't sure. And so, it's very easy to try and put yourself in their shoes and get it wrong. But if I was in his shoes, I would think, wow, maybe it's going to go up, but this is the best time. This is the best price it's ever been. And, sell now. And then once again, 2015, he sold again at a lower price, right? Maybe he thought it was going to go much higher and it was going down, and he just, decided, I'm going to sell again before it goes much further down. And of course it did go further down, but then it climbed back up. Okay, so what's the picture as far as I can tell? Obviously they're not selling exactly on the same dates, although it was very, very close, right? The end of October, beginning of November, they all clearly sold. So $55, from my perspective, that was, I think all the executives are saying the stock is not worth that much. They all sold, right? That was a huge sell. Then, at the beginning of 2019, you saw some people selling at a peak there at, let's say, $45. And of course, Carl Glassman, the CEO, at the end of 2000, right, September, he sold clearly not close to that peak, right, at a little bit above $40, around there. So the question is, is it even worth, legitimately, without everything going on, $40? I would assume, I think it's fair to say that, yes, a number of executives thought that it was worth more than $40. It wasn't worth selling en masse. But $55, yes, everyone sold, en masse, enormous amounts of their stocks. And, they sold every time it got above $45. It seems you see this general selling, right? Whether it's 2015, whether it's 2017, right? They seem to be selling when it goes beyond that $45 mark. And so what's fair value of this stock? I don't know. That's very difficult. But watch part 1, part 2. And you can see that this company's having a lot of trouble in terms of stagnating. And, can they grow? Yes, they're opening up new avenues of growth. Are they going to be successful? I don't know. It's difficult. Yes, they have a lot of money behind them. And we'll talk about what's going to happen with this company, specifically in the situation we're in now. But before this situation, I think it's important to understand that $55 was way, as far as the executives seem to show by itself they're selling, way over the mark, way over the mark. Even $45 might be a great time to sell. And so how, the question is, how much lower can this stock go? So yes, it's gone down quite substantially, everything going on now, but is this discounted from where it should be, right? That's the real question. Where it should be, is it being discounted enough from that price, right? So $45 is a for sure, let's say, sale based off of executive trading, somewhere between $40 and $45. And so presumably the value of the stock, as far as they can tell, based off of what they think stock buyers will value it at, might be even lower. And they're seeing a good deal at $40 to $45, especially $45. So let's keep that in mind, right? How much are you going to gain when this whole stock snaps back? So are you playing this as a dividend buy, right? 5% dividend, over 5%, that's not bad if they can keep that up. And we'll talk about that exactly. But so as far as I can tell, I don't want to ramble too much at this point, but it's not looking like it's fallen far enough from the high, or I shouldn't say the high. Yes, it has fallen far enough maybe from the high, but from what it should be valued at, has it fallen far enough? No, I don't think so. I think it's rallied, and I think that rally is a mistake. Now, of course, this is for entertainment purposes only, so take everything with a grain of salt, and we're only discussing insider trading. But I do think it says a lot, and sadly, we're probably not going to get a tip from the insiders when they start buying because, like I said, in the past, whatever it is, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there's very little buying from insiders, right? They just take their stock from awards. And you can disagree with me. Let me know what you think based off of insider purchases. Do you think that you can really gain enough here from the sales? Usually people say you can't gain insight about the stock from the sales of executives. I think this is an exception, personally, based off of everyone selling in similar fashion. I don't think all of them are buying houses at the same time or need money at the same time. They're all just doing this based off of, I think, the value of the stock, personally. Let me know what you think. Please comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much for watching to the end. And once again, let me know what you think and what stocks you would love to analyze next. And I'll try and do a roundup of my thoughts on this stock, especially what's going on, because I think there's a doozy coming for this stock. That's my personal opinion. Once again, entertainment purposes only.